Chapter 5, New Personalities for Old. Some techniques for modifying behavior are relatively reversible. Others are, in some sense, irreversible. Gardner C. Quarton, psychiatrist. In the last chapter, we were talking primarily about temporary or short-term changes in behavior. In this one, we will discuss the ways in which a number of scientists are attempting to mold or remold basic aspects of the human personality. Some are focusing on very early childhood, when the potential for moldability is highest. At birth, an infant has a large brain for the size of its body, but the baby is still close to being mindless. Every cell in its body contains the genetic code that will largely dictate its physical characteristics. The code will later influence somewhat the new individual's mental functioning. The ancient part of the brain concerned with self-preservation is functioning at birth, but the bulk of the brain of newborn human baby can be thought of as a blank ball of wax awaiting impressions throughout its mass. Inside the ball of the brain, the billions of nerve cells are tied into a network of chemical electrical wishes. In these cells, the impressions received from the five senses, which capture one's life experiences, will be processed and stored. At birth, the nerve cells are in place, but growth of the billions of fingers that reach out to make interconnections with other cells have barely begun. Thus, capacity for thought at birth is apparently slight. The human baby in its first several weeks of life is mainly preoccupied with survival. The infant is incapable of true social smile until about the 6th week. Eye coordination comes about slowly so that the first few months of the baby may smile at any nodding object with the configuration of a human face. That configuration can be a head covered with a grotesque mask, or it can be a dummy's head. There appear to be critical periods in human development when the brain of the infant or child becomes extraordinarily receptive to developing certain aspects of behavior and personality. Benjamin Bloom, an educational psychologist at the University of Chicago, found that each human characteristic has its own growth curve. The easiest time to make important changes in a child's intelligence, for example, is before the age of 4. By that time, intelligence is stabilized to the point at which IQ measurement takes on noteworthy significance. Professional imprinters. A number of respected scientists believe that the brains of young humans accept some imprinting of behavior pattern in those critical periods. By imprinting, I mean a type of learning that can occur only with a limited period of time early in life and is relatively unmodifiable thereafter. That animals have critical periods for imprinting is well established. The Austrian ethologist Konrad Lorenz pioneered the classic experiments on imprinting in animals. He arranged for himself to be the first moving object that mallard ducklings encountered after hatching. Lorenz waddled in a squatting position so that he had the height-width ratio of a mother duck, and he quacked like a mother duck. The ducklings fixed on him as their mother, following him in file wherever he went, and came flying to him when he quacked. The psychologist Harry Harlow, while at the University of Wisconsin, imprinted baby monkeys to accept as their mother a foam rubber dummy monkey with a built-in feeding bottle. Kittens have been imprinted to accept as fellow kittens, rats placed in the same cage with them. The critical importance of timing in the development of certain skills was dramatized by 2 Harvard scientists who studied the way kittens' eyes develop, the ability to recognize shapes and patterns. The ability, which is psychological development, not imprinting, apparently develops in the 4th week. If kittens are blindfolded during this week, they become, for all practical purposes, blind for life. For humans, the child psychologist Philip H. Gray placed the most critical period for imprinting behavior patterns at from 6 weeks to about 6 months, or roughly at the onset of learning ability. Others place it later. Many psychologists have difficulty reconciling the idea of imprinting as a very rapid and irreversible effect with the traditional, more fluid concepts of human learning. Those who recognize human imprinting consider it a more complex process than Lorenz experienced with ducks. The noted child specialist E.J.M. Bowlby, however, insisted that the way the human infant develops attachment behavior legitimately comes under the heading of imprinting. Jose Delgado also talks of what he considers to be imprinting and suggested to me another reason why the time element is critical. Imprinting decreases at certain ages. Pathways of the brain close at certain ages for every function. You can't become a good musician if you start too late. I did not start to learn English until I was 20, which is why I can't get rid of my Spanish accent. My children have lived in both Spain and America and have no accent. Whether you call it imprinting or not, we can be fairly certain that humans are particularly impressionable in their development at certain times. And the most impressionable period for many characteristics, including personality, is early childhood. The most decisive period in a child's intellectual, social, and emotional development is between 8 and 18 months, according to Burton White, a Harvard specialist in child development. This is when the child is moving out of the crib, exploring learning language, and how a child is handling during these months is more critical to developing general ability than at any other time. Delgado, too, believes that expert help is needed. We should try to establish at the earliest possible moment of the baby's life a program of psychogenesis. By that, he means the use of available physiological, psychological, and psychiatric knowledge for the formation of the child's personality. Delgado agrees there is strong possibility that professional imprinters will emerge. He adds, though, but to imprint for what? What kind of humans do we want to construct? The already set personalities of young people can be remolded or at least profoundly redirected. A number of techniques have recently been explored. One, a kind of youthful brainwashing emerged as a side effect of a federally funded program in Florida. The aim was to rehabilitate adolescents believed to be drug users. The program, called The Seed, apparently was quite successful in getting the young people off drugs. But the controversy of personality changes accompanying this rehabilitation caused the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to back off. The youths, or seedlings, pressed into this program were isolated from family, friends, and the outside world. They were stripped of all identification and thrust at a low position into a precise social structure. Then they were subjected to carefully managed intense peer group pressure from fellow seedlings already in the program. A seedling could advance upward in the structure only by a rigid right thinking. There was a good deal of talk about goodness and love, but there was also a deliberate effort to smash the new seedling's psychological defenses and make him feel totally dependent on the group. During the U.S. Senate hearings on the program, the statement of guidance counselor at the North Miami Beach Senior High School was introduced. She had encountered many returned seedlings. The statement read in part, "When they return, they are straight, namely quiet, well-dressed, with short hair and not under the influence of drug compared with their previous appearance of being stoned most of the time. However, they seem to be living in a robot-like atmosphere. They won't speak to anyone outside their own group. They sit in a class together and the classes become divided with seedlings opposed to non-seedlings. Seedlings seem to have an informing system on each other and on others that is similar to Nazi Germany. They run in to use the telephone daily to report against each other to the seed." Personality changes by electricity. Apparently, personality transformations can be triggered by the prolonged use of electrical stimulation, if accompanied by counseling. Electrodes can remain in place for months in the human brain without discomfort. Jose Delgado reports that lasting changes in behavior, including decreased friendliness, could be induced by reticular stimulation in gibbons. Robert Heath of Tulane University and his collaborator Charles Moan found that a conspicuous element of one patient's personality underwent lasting changes because of electrical stimulation. The discovery was a result of an interesting treatment they arranged. This included stimulation of the septal pleasure center in the brain. The patient had long been suicidally depressed and had been a drug addict. He was a homosexual and tended to be chronically angry. He was first shown a stag film of nude males and females frolicking. He reacted with anger and disgust. Later, the pleasure center of his brain was subject to a series of simulations that put him in a state of euphoria. During the following year, counseling continued on an outpatient basis. He developed a close sexual attachment to another girl and reported that he had become heterosexually oriented. If such a technique were to become easily available, some legislature might pass a law requiring everyone convicted of homosexual charge to undergo the treatment. That, of course, would be contrary to the wishes and beliefs of the majority of the homosexual community. New personalities by surgery of the mind. The fact that personality can be transformed by surgery has best been known ever since the potentates of the ancient Middle East put eunuchs in charge of their harems. In recent years, brain surgeons have become adept at effecting a variety of personality changes by either cutting or burning inside the brain. Since the brain is the organ of the body fundamental to human identity, modify it and you modify identity. The brain can also be modified in its function on a long-term basis by the use of chemicals. For example, the equivalent of castration can apparently now be achieved chemically by treating a person with an anti-androgen drug called cyproterine acetate, which was developed in West Germany. Some animal studies have shown that it can cause permanent atrophy of the secondary sex glands. The castration effect can also be created surgically by destroying brain areas connected with the sexual drive. Surgery of the psyche is designed to modify personality, ways of thinking, and ways of behaving and feeling. It is also known as mental surgery, lobotomy, sedative neurosurgery, and most commonly psychosurgery. In its earliest and still used form, it was the operation called lobotomy. This involves the simple severing of fibers between the frontal lobes and the deeper portions of the brain. Experiments with a chimpanzee had shown that destruction of certain frontal regions of the brain eliminated temper tantrums. Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz happened to hear a reference to the chimpanzee experiment at an international meeting and went home and performed lobotomies on 20 long-term psychotics. He claimed improvement in most of the cases and won himself a Nobel Prize. Soon the craze for lobotomy spread. The craze was helped by a challenge that World War II had created. After the war, tens of thousands of severely disturbed veterans were swelling veterans hospitals. The U.S. Veterans Administration backed the operation in hope of getting the patients home. Many of the operations performed during this period did not involve opening the scalp. Some surgeons simply ran an ice pick or other devices resembling an ice pick past the eyeball and wiggle it around for a little while. This was to sever fibers connected to the frontal lobes. Certain people doing the operation were not even surgeons. One doctor who did several thousand lobotomies for Walter Freeman of George Washington University. He said it was a simple matter to perform a dozen supraorbital lobotomies in a few hours at the operating table. Here, wonder of wonders was a permanent pacifier. It seemed to transform the agitated, the violent, the distressed, and compulsive. Great numbers of patients did seem transformed enough to be sent home from mental hospitals. But then the reports of frequent undesirable side effects started coming in. Some lobotomized subjects became so placid they were barely able to bestir themselves. Many were dubbed vegetables. Others dramatically lost their inhibition against doing what they had previously considered to be immoral. Loss of creativity and loss of intellectual capacity were reported. In general, there were frequently seemed to be a blunting of what one lobotomy specialist called the higher sensibilities. As recently as August 1975, the Archives of General Psychiatry carried a long-term assessment of 43 lobotomies on mentally troubled people. The principal author was a psychiatrist whose evaluations initiated the operations. Most of the patients were said to show no longer the specific symptoms that had inspired the operation. These symptoms were obsessive, compulsive, or hypochondriacal behavior. However, most still had problems. 17 had incurred substantial gains in weight. By the mid-1950s, there was a growing wariness of lobotomy, and two additional developments contributed to a sharp drop in its use for several years: the introduction of strong tranquilizers and electroshock. Both seemed to have the effect of changing distraught personalities to more bland ones. Starting in the mid-1960s, however, surgery of the psyche was on the rise again. Several developments account for the increase: the perfection of stereotaxic head clamp method for precise entry of surgical instruments deep into the brain. The growth in knowledge about the role of the deep down limbic system in controlling emotions and about the dramatic changes that can be triggered there. New, more adroit, less tissue destructive techniques for performing modified lobotomies. Today, brain structure and personality is being changed by surgical cutting, by burning brain cells with the tip of an implanted instruments, by injecting olive oil, by implanting radioactive seeds, by ultrasonic beams, by freezing local areas, and by proton beams that explore their charge at a specific distance. Laser beams and cell destruction by chemicals to achieve brain modification can also be investigated. Reports of long-term reduction of chronic anxiety in some cases have come from psychosurgeons who use differing techniques and who operate on different areas of the brain. The British have done a considerable amount of work on altering anxiety and depressive states. One team that performed more than 200 operations found that nearly half of the patients underwent a change of personality. In one publicized case in England, a young salesman with an apparent compulsion to gamble was arrested for larceny. A medical report was prepared on his condition as observed by psychiatrists at a Lancashire mental hospital. The report recommended a brain operation to cure him of his compulsion. The magistrate ordered the operation. There was a public uproar. England has millions of steady gamblers. The magistrate withdrew his order. In animals, at least, operations on the amygdala sometimes produce spectacular hypersexuality. Male cats, for example, try to mount any other four-footed animal they can climb on. Significant increase in aggressiveness have in some cases occurred after destruction of a portion of the hypothalamus. The psychiatrist J.M.C. Holden studied the results of several hundred lobotomies performed in the Middle West. He reports that a frequent effect of extensive cutting is an irreversible change in mood, emotion, temperament, and all higher mental functions. It is the success in transforming aggressive, violent, or agitated people by surgical intervention deep in the brain that has provoked the most speculation. Surgeons in Mexico, Japan, France, Denmark, and the United States, to mention just a few countries, have been treating violent behavior by destroying a part of the amygdala. That limbic organ is the most conspicuous seat of our emotions. Others in Japan have engaged in sedative surgery by destroying tiny bits of the hypothalamus. Louis Stoyland West, a noted brain surgeon at the University of California, Los Angeles, reported an interesting success story. A waitress who had repeatedly tried to slash herself had to be confined to a straitjacket for several years. After an operation on her amygdala, her rages stopped and she was able to find a steady job. The Boston brain surgeon Vernon H. Mark and his colleagues performed more than a dozen operations on the amygdalas of patients with a history of violence. They believed the violence to be associated with an epilepsy. One case in which Mark was the principal figure was that a 21-year-old girl named Julia. She was an epileptic and she also had many seemingly senseless assaults on people, some of them total strangers. The surgeon, in consultation with psychiatrists, came to believe that some of her assaults and rages were substitutes for usual convulsions of epilepsy. Following the removal of part of her amygdala, she had fewer epileptic seizures and only occasional exhibitions of abnormal anger, though she was still judged as psychotic. She was able to live at home, sing in the church choir, and pass her high school equivalency examinations. Others, however, reported that the operation she became more despondent, stopped playing her guitar, and showed less interest in intellectual discussions. Studies of the results of amygdalectomies upon monkeys are disquieting, in the opinion of Stephen L. Corover, psychological psychologist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. After the operations, the monkeys become less hostile toward the human handlers, but act in many inappropriate ways when returned to their troop. Their inability to cope made them social isolates, and they either starved to death or were killed by predators. Is this a lesson here for humans as far as tampering with the amygdala is concerned? Corover thinks so, and cites the case of a brilliant engineer who had a tendency to go into rages. He was referred to a Boston surgeon who suspected from studies of his brain-like brainwave activity that his behavior might be a form of epilepsy. Corover contends that the existence of causal connection between epilepsy and violence remains an open question. At any rate, the engineer finally agreed, after weeks of patient explanation by surgeon, to have cuts made in his amygdala. 4 years after the operation, the surgeon stated that the engineer had not had a single episode of rage since the operation, but he did continue to have an occasional epileptic seizure with periods of confusion and disordered thinking. Corover reports, however, that this brief summary blurred over the true situation. The engineer's family invited a Washington psychiatrist to make an independent review of the case. The psychiatrist reported that after the operation, the engineer lost his job and his wife and was so confused. He was unable to work and was incapable of taking care of himself that periodically he had to be hospitalized. There has been a tendency on the part of some surgeons to justify operating on the ground that the violent behavior is somehow related to one or another brain disease, that gets them out of the controversial behavior control business. One enthusiast of psychosurgery, Orlando J. Andy of the University of Mississippi, went so far as to propose that all abnormal behavior results from structurally abnormal brain tissue. Proving this relationship is pretty hard to do, however. Most of the limbic system is difficult to X-ray. Also, most of the electrical activity in that area is hard to pick up on the conventional brainwave instruments placed on the scalp. Only implants deep into the brain at the suspected site can pick up dependable brainwave cues. If an absurd person is made into a placid person by surgery, it is irreversible change. He isn't the same person anymore. How much manipulation of personality by intrusion into the brain is justifiable? Should it be restricted to mental hospital patients with certifiable brain damage who want to change? Or if they are mentally incompetent, whose closest kin requests the operation? Do we really know enough about brain function and the often delayed effects of altering the brain to justify irreversible surgery except in extreme cases? By extreme, I mean people with provable brain damage and people suffering constant, unrelievable pain. I don't think we know enough. We should confine psychosurgery in these extreme cases and then only after a hospital committee has reviewed all the facts. A line must be drawn. If we get into the business of having surgeons operating on the brains of people judged by them or by governmental authorities to be too aggressive or belligerent for the good of society, then psychosurgery can become a convenient tool for social control. We will take a look at this potentiality early in the next chapter.